I'm BrianVee, and this is Why We Work. Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Andrew Allemann. Andrew is a technology media publisher where he focuses primarily on domain names. He also runs podcastguests.com. Today, I want to find out about domain names, some terminology that is in the industry, as well as why it might be important for you and I to consider investing in domain names. Join me in my conversation today with Andrew Allemann. I'm BrianVee, and this is Why We Work. Today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Andrew Allemann. Good evening, fine sir.
Yeah, it's sort of afternoon. It's 3 o'clock here.
Evening, we got 8 a.m. here. I thank you for coming on here, sir. I've been watching a few of your interviews done. Will you give us an idea, so my information is not out of date, of what you're up to now and what it is you do?
Sure. So I run a couple of businesses. One is podcastguests.com, which connects podcasters with guests for their shows. That's how we connected. And then I also run a kind of think of it as a publication for the domain name industry, kind of like a trade publication called Domain Name Wire.
And I have to ask you to be quite gracious with me today, because I've seen a couple of your interviews and I'm probably on the lower rung of intelligence of the people you have been speaking to.
No.
So please just bear with me for these 45 minutes or maybe 44. Will you do me a favor and bring us back to what would have been your very first job? Maybe not technology related, but something maybe in your teens, the first thing you've ever done to get out of the house and make a dollar.
Oh, well, my first job was working for a company, and I was in high school. So I was 16 in St. Louis. And there was a business called Discovery Zone. And this is one of those indoor children's play gyms.
Yeah.
So I know now today that the trampolines and the jump houses are a big thing, but think of this more like a McDonald's playground on steroids, right? They had tubes going all over, they had ball pits and that sort of thing. And I think minimum wage back then in the U.S. was $4.25, and that's what they paid us. And so it's an interesting job.
Why did you get it? Why did you go out of the house at 16 for that?
Well, it's kind of, I mean, that's when in the United States, you can legally get a job. And I've always, thought that it's good to work, right? And I know, at least back then, most of my peers, right, would also get a job during school, so they could pay for either car payments, car insurance, going out on the, weekends, going to the movies. You have to get that money somewhere. And just kind of, I think I've always, even in college, I was working. So high school, what was that? Probably sophomore through senior year, I was working, whether it was bagging groceries at the grocery store or doing something else. It was, just always working somewhere.
So for high school, so you're bringing in up high school, the idea of college that you just mentioned, what were you thinking for your future? What was on your horizon?
Well, I always thought I would go into banking, investment banking. I always had my eye on, the professions.
Sorry, Andrew. Like I said, I'm on the lower rung. And for me in high school to be thinking investment banking, I don't know if I could have said it, let alone applied for it. So, and you said, well, everyone's, wanting to do this and wanting to do, I wasn't. So right. It depends on the circles you hung out with, but I wasn't. And to go to university, like, okay, if this is what, so I didn't have that foresight to know these might be good industries to get into. So was there a family influence? Were you just watching some things that kind of kept you on the straight and narrow to say financial banking, right? Or investment banking?
I think, I would read the Wall Street Journal. I'd read financial publications. At the time it was Business Week, I mean, you get this physical copy in the mail, right? Of your magazines, right? And so I think it was that. I think maybe one of my other interests in finance was when I was young, I told my dad about some companies that I thought were interesting. One of them was Electronic Arts, and they just launched their Madden 93 football game or something like that. And I was like, Dad, this is a really good game. And, back then the newspaper had a financial section with literally all the stock quotes, right? You'd open it up and there were stock quotes for, I don't know how many companies. It was pages and pages. This was just in your local paper. And I said, hey, Dad, this company is publicly traded. This game's really cool. And he said, well, tell me about some other companies you know about. And he invested in a few of them, not a whole lot of money, but Electronic Arts was one that worked out really well.
Based on your tips or your
yeah. I mean, and when you think about it, why not ask your kid about the companies that they're interested in? Because it's not like as a parent what and then you can look into the stocks and see what companies are. And learn more about them, right? It's always good to invest in companies that make sense. And if it makes sense to your kid, if they like the products, why not?
Thinking of listeners and people with parents or children themselves or younger people, do you think that helped and built some confidence in you in your idea of finance?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And this, there are things, I've learned over the past 20, 30 years. I've understood my privilege and, having, a parent in the corporate world who read the business section, who got a newspaper every day that I could read through and that sort of thing. It's having parents that are role models in that way certainly helps you when you look toward the future. And it's something that as I've become frankly middle age now, it's something looking back, I'm like, wow, it'd be great if more people who are in their teenage years are exposed to more to business, to the future and that sort of thing. I think that would really help a lot of people as they go through high school and college and that sort of thing.
You're touching on a very good point, and that's why part of the reason why I started this podcast with, if someone doesn't have those parents, they don't have that influence at home, then I can ask people like yourself to come on and see how their path was written for them and what decisions that they had made. And I can learn from that. Someone else can learn from that, regardless if we had a direct influence from a family member or not. And I think it's great that, you're looking at stocks, and your dad helped you and encouraged you by picking those things. And then that kind of whet your appetite for choosing what you did for college. So you went on to college or university and you did take investment
I did do
banking?
finance.
You did do
I did
finance.
do finance. I got a degree in finance. And so at the time, the hot companies to work for were investment banks. This was, I graduated in 2000 from college. So investment banks and consulting firms were both, for the most part, the higher paying, more glamorous jobs coming out of college.
Wait a second, Andrew. You said you were middle-aged, and I should have graduated in 2000. So am I middle-aged too? Is this, are we
I
like the
hate to
40
admit it,
something?
but
Are
I
we
think when we're in
middle-aged?
our 40s, I think we kind of have
Oh, I
to.
don't think
I don't
everyone,
say it
no one's
much.
ever said that to me before. Like, oh,
I
middle-aged.
wasn't
Okay.
40 was middle age, and then when I turned 40, I was like, that's not middle age. But
Yeah. My body would say I'm
I think we have
middle-aged,
to
but
admit, yes, I hear you there.
so
So
as you were going through this, were you thinking of a career? Were you thinking where this was going to take you? Or were you looking at a master's as well? What was your thought process?
yeah. I mean, finance is a very vocational kind of study. Well, business is a vocational study for college, right? As opposed to the liberal arts. So yes, I mean, I was thinking about, okay, I do this for 4 years. I go get a job. And if you go into banking or consulting, you usually work for maybe 5 years and then go back and get an MBA, Master's of Business. But things changed because I was going through college when the dot-com boom was really at its height, right? I mean, it kind of busted in 2000, 2001. And I ended up taking a job with a hot flying startup in Austin that paid ridiculous amounts of money. There was some equity involved. So, there was the dream of hitting it big, right? Going
This was the
public and
time where everyone's just throwing money around for this big
throwing,
opportunity.
it was funny money, which kind of reminds me of the times we're in again. But I mean, the valuations of companies that had, lost tons of money a year were, there were like lots of Teslas out there all over the world, from a stock perspective where, um,
It's trading at what, 700 now or something?
I, I don't know, but remember it did like a 4-for-1 stock split. So that's really close to 3,000. And it's silly, right? We all know it's not worth that much.
Hmm.
But people were like, well, but I can trade in it and make money. So there were very bubbly times back then, just like they are now. You look at cryptocurrencies, you look at some of these high flying tech stocks where you just can't, there's no way you can justify the valuation of some of these. And that's what it was like back then. And there were companies going public that hadn't even made a dime of revenue, there were, and ironically enough, some of these business models have come back now 20 years later, like the local delivery model. I'm trying to think of the name of the one in New York City that, lost gobs of money on every delivery they did. But venture capitalists loved it because they're like, oh, well, you've got eyeballs and you've got revenue that's growing a lot, even though you lose money on every order you fulfill. So we've kind of come full circle around this.
When
But
did
that's
you, sorry, you go ahead.
that's what it was like at the time. So.
When did you start to get traction and even all the funny money and realizing your niche in this particular industry?
Well, so I went to do finance for this hot
Yeah.
flying startup that then kind of burst with the bubble. And I ended up taking a job at a Fortune 500 for a few years, and I was just miserable. At least toward the end, I remember driving to work one day, and I had a little bit of a lead foot, and I was driving along, speeding, and I was like, wait, why am I speeding to work? I don't like what I'm doing.
Was the opposite of that true when you first got the job, you were excited to get into this Fortune
Some
500
some
company?
jobs I've done, yes, but that job at the Fortune 500 was really, hey, I need a job. The
Yeah.
economy is
Hmm.
is busted here. I you have to work right at that age. I thankfully didn't have any college debt because university was
Sorry,
a
Andrew,
lot less expensive.
the idea of, you said you have to work, and that's what I want to promote because not all people believe that, Andrew.
Well,
Right? Not all people, like, I just, to encourage people, you got to work. You got to keep doing something no matter what. If something doesn't matter if you come from a big company or not, or you're making some money, and then, but one day that's, it's going to dry up and you might have to find something else. You have to stay motivated. You have to have that
mhm,
desire to keep going because, you might have a family, you might have your own bills to pay, but there are people, just to acknowledge, there are people that just don't believe that you have to work. You have to keep going if you have the ability to do so. So I commend you for realizing, I mean, you had the intelligence, but some people get discouraged, right? Maybe out of university,
right,
you did something and then you had this job and then it sizzles out. And then, oh, well, now what am I going to do? Right. Some
right.
people would get, I mean, some people go down some pretty bad paths too, in depression and feeling bad about themselves. And so I just commend you for realizing and saying, but not overlooking the fact that not all people believe the same thing you
Mm,
do, which is
mhm.
work is important, right? And we should do it even when we come across these difficult times, especially changing careers.
Right. Yeah. And changing, I mean, when I went from that high flying startup to a Fortune 500, I took a pay cut, took a big pay cut. I actually had to commute to San Antonio for a while. I had just gotten married and my wife was working in Austin. So I had, it's about
A few, how
it's
many
about an
hours is
hour
that?
and a half drive.
Yeah, that's
So I
tough.
got an apartment down there for during the week and I come
Mhm.
back a couple times during the week. Um, but if you think that you want to have a long career, you can't have like a year gap after after leaving a company because then
Yeah.
people ask about that. And at the time, of course, I was inexperienced. I didn't have much experience. I was 22, 23,
Andrew,
right?
that's a good thing you brought up, and I don't think I ever thought of that, is in the idea of the gap.
Hmm.
Would you say someone, if they find themselves in between a rock and a hard place, fill that gap with something?
Ooh, so here's, I think my philosophy on this has changed, and I think it was a specific situation. If you think you are going to work for companies all of your life, um, they and they see gaps, there needs to be an excuse behind that. Like I know people all the time who are like, you know what, I've done well, I'm going to take a year off.
Mhm.
That's very different from having major gaps on your resume, if you will, because you can't find work,
Looking for
right?
employment or something, yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
That's good. So as you were pathing out or setting out your path before you, I know you had several positions. You were chairman, you were working in business development, sponsorships, and you're the creator of what you are now with podcast
Mhm.
guests and the owner of domain names Wire. Because I don't want to take up too much of your time. When did you really jump into domain names in particular and websites as your full-time position?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part time around 2005. I was making enough money on the side that I decided to quit my Fortune 500 job. But then I started another company with someone, did that for a few years. And then I'd say after that, I went full time. So probably around 2008, kind of around the great recession, if you will. That's probably when I kind of went out on my own full time.
So besides other investments and other sorts of things you might be doing, I think I heard, you invest in property. Would you say it's a 50-50 split in your work between podcast guests and domain names, or is it lean more on one side or
I
the
would
other?
say it's about 50-50 between those two. Podcast guests has become a very, it takes a little bit more time than it used to because it's grown significantly. Last year, 2020 was a big year for podcasting.
I
So,
have to commend you again because you must have a lot of people coming on your site, and it's a service that can be paid or not, which I find is
mhm,
great for people who are just starting or not quite sure, but other people who want to promote themselves, it's a paid service.
mhm,
And you're in my inbox. I have so many emails, but I don't touch them because I have a podcast. I'm waiting, right, to get
mhm,
through the list of people who I have are booked already, and then I'll go in it and pick. And like I don't want it. They're very precious to me. Like,
right.
so I
Very
mean, you're
good.
saying it's over 20 something thousand people that you have in your directory.
It's
With
about,
with
yeah.
with that and domain name Wire, what is the process that you go through, say, in a week with the work that you do?
Right. Yeah. So domain name wire, I blog usually 2, 3, 4 times per weekday. And so really my first stop in the morning is my inbox. And one of the reasons I know I like what I do is it's like Christmas every morning when I get into my inbox. Whereas I think when I worked for companies, it's like, oh, open this up. There are going to be people that need stuff, right? They need me to do stuff.
It's
Whereas in
funny
this case,
because you have this, for you it's gifts, and for me the gift that you give me is your email every day. It really is. It's like a really
yeah.
precious thing because I know for me as a podcaster, there's people behind that. There's
Hmm.
stories behind that. In For any podcast, not just one on work, you have a whole range of customers
Right.
that go to your site.
Right. Yeah. It's really amazing how many different people are out there with so many different and interesting stories, and that's something I've really discovered through going through this process. Starting it 4 years ago with just 100 people, and building it up to now 28,000 people get the emails, almost 28,000. Um, so it's grown quite a bit. It's grown quite a bit, and the nice thing is that I set it up purposely to kind of scale and not require too much time,
Mhm.
so I can, when I open up my email, I can address anything that's kind of urgent. Whenever there's a podcast guest customer service request, I try to respond as soon as I can because I think that impresses people. Frankly, they're like, "Oh yeah, this is legit. This is good service," as opposed to waiting for days to hear back, like you're used to with email customer service. Um,
What was
and
the process of the podcastguests.com? Was it being in domain names? Was it, oh, this is a good domain name?
so yeah,
And then this
mhm.
became a company and you, hey, I'm going to ride this out.
So the genesis is that I was doing my own podcast. I still do my own podcast about domain names for Domain Name Wire. And after about doing 50 of the podcasts, I said, it was a guest format, kind of like this. I was like, I need some more new and interesting guests. And I don't, I've tapped my Rolodex. I've had some great people on, but how can I find people that are new and different? And so I looked out there for a service that would help me with that. And there were, and still are, a lot of kind of agency model services that you can pay $1,000 a month and they'll book people for you. But I wanted to
Thanks.
find something that would, that was more accessible to people, right? If you're
Yeah.
just starting out and that sort of thing. So I was like, well, why don't I create my own service to fill this need? Certainly I'm not the only one who has it. And that ended up being right. And it was very slow at the beginning, a lot of elbow grease, getting people to buy into it and come, even though it was free, right, to join. But now it's really taken off and it's growing substantially from an organic perspective.
I'm not sure how it happened for me. I mean, I've came upon your website, but eventually after I had some podcasts, I was able to advertise myself as a spotlight for the week. And that I got an overflow of responses, which was overwhelming in itself. But what I liked about whoever it was that contacted me in your company was they said, okay, you have these people, but if you want, you don't have to look at this other list of these paid subscribers, people who pay for the service, and just contact one or two if you like, just to know.
Sure.
And for me, all of it's free. So it doesn't matter who I contact. And in most cases, it's better to look at the people who pay because they give a full description. They give
Right.
they've probably been on the internet before.
They're serious about it. Yeah,
Very
they're serious about
so
it.
I really like that. It was a subtle way of whoever contacted me and said that, and it was really nice because it wasn't you weren't overbearing. You were just really welcoming, and it seemed like a very supportive platform.
Well,
For, as you
good.
said, the
That's great
regular
feedback.
person.
Yeah, great
So
feedback.
with domain names in particular, I'm on the bottom rung. Why should it be important to me or other people to consider domain names as well as maybe as an investment tool?
So domain investing in domain names, which means buying domain names with the hopes of selling them for more money, is a kind of it's a niche. And there are thousands of people that do it kind of on the side, only a handful, maybe in the hundreds, that do that full time. And I think a lot of people are attracted to it because everyone hears these success stories where someone buys a domain name and then someone comes along and wants to buy it for, say, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is very rare, but it happens. And it's kind of got, unfortunately, I would think it's got this kind of this get rich quick mentality around it. It's really more of a slog, though. If you ask any domain investor, they'll tell you it's hard work and you make a lot of mistakes. You make a lot of bad bets as well. The industry, though, I've just found fascinating. Having known a lot of people in it for nearly 2 decades now, just a fun. It's kind of like an extended family to me, and that's one of the reasons that I continue to be involved with it.
Would you say that there's one that you were most successful with? I don't know if it's financially, but most proud of either. So are you buying them, coming up with them, buying them, and then selling them? Like not maybe regularly, but at times have you? And is there one that you're like,
Right.
I had Nike.com or something?
Yeah, I don't have any. So first of all, I never buy like a trademark like Nike, but one of my favorite domains that I own is dnw.com. So my blog is domainnamewire.com, and I had the opportunity to acquire a 3-letter domain, which gives you more credibility. They're not cheap, but it gives you more credibility. And so I was excited to get that one. And that's kind of the one when people ask me, what's your favorite domain that you own? That's the one that I tell them.
Why does .com hold on so well? And what's the hesitancy of people to jump into these other niches, as you mentioned?
It's mind share. It's the default that people remember something by. And I'll say this changes depending on where you are in the world. But in the United States and in many countries, especially that were early to the internet and that are English speaking, .com is kind of the default. right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you tell someone your name, the first thing they're going to do is type that into the browser and put .com behind it. So if you don't have the .com, they might go to a competitor's site, or they can't find you as easily. And in 2014, they started bringing out just hundreds of extensions like .cash, .guru, really, I mean, hundreds, .ninja, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's some crazy ones out there. And there's a market for this, but they still have the downside of memorability and people sometimes confusing them with .com.
Do you think this is something the public or the consumer can get over?
Slowly, slowly. I mean, we already have, you've probably seen websites ending in .io and .co and other extensions. And I think over time, people might become more used to it. And maybe the next generation, people that aren't middle-aged like us, forgive me, but they, maybe if they grow up seeing all these additional extensions, maybe that will change. But I think it's a very slow process.
It's funny how short the industry has been available, but we're
Mm.
so hardened towards keeping our old ways of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
pretty interesting. What do you
It's
find difficult about what it is you do, and some satisfaction you get out of what you do?
Well, in the domain name blog on domainnamewire.com, one of the difficulties is just kind of the expectation of always putting up content, right? There's never a break. And so, although I can choose, like yesterday when my power was out all day, I can choose to not work for the day, maybe knock out a few things that I need to get done, but then not work for the rest of the day. I would say in the past 15 years, I haven't really taken a vacation where I don't open up my laptop. Right. And so that's one of the downsides, I think, and one of the challenges to owning your own business that's really just you, right? A solopreneur. I do have people that help me. I do have an additional writer on the blog, and I have Jessica, who I think sent that email to you were
Yes,
referring
yes,
to.
yes, yes.
But still at the end of the day, it's my thing. I don't have a huge team, and so there's some sort of sense of responsibility and continuity that you have to keep.
The idea of not taking much time off, or at least doing something for your work each day, as well as writing the content multiple times a day. Can you comment on that for people about work? Because to me, it seems, well, there could be a high demand for it, but there's also the fear or the scariness of that if you're not putting new content out, someone else is. So
Yeah.
there's a competition for you're trying to get their ear or their eye.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the daily grind, because if
It
you're not
is.
going to
And
do it, and someone else will surely take your spot.
when I started Domain Name Wire, there were no domain blogs out there. And now there are a handful, right? A half dozen or so of ones that people read. And I am in competition with them too, right? Because it's not only getting the content out there and getting people to read it, but it's being first, right? With the things that are new and interesting. And so there is a bit of pressure there. And I've seen people start publications where they aren't trying to break news, where they're just analyzing. And it's a very different, it's a different lifestyle, if you will. It's not as rushed, as pushed is what I'm doing with that site.
Knowing that it is a daily grind, and how you worked, what was it, the Discovery Zone, and when you were 16, starting your first job, but also a number that I know of, at least 8 different positions that you have held, and probably many more. Do you have a tip for people who are just getting into work, or
Just getting into work.
or people who are changing their career?
Hmm. Well, probably a lot. I would say the first thing, and I think this is probably fairly common today, is to not just work for one place forever. And my dad worked for the same company for the first 30 years of his career, and I think that people these days want to see someone who has worked at multiple companies and gotten multiple experiences. And I think that's how you grow your salary faster too. I mean, I haven't really had a salary in ages, but I see, I have hired people in certain times, and you tend to, when you work at the same company, you tend to get these little bumps, right? The 3% raise this year to 5%. Maybe it's a great year. Maybe you get promoted and it's a 10% bump. But really the 20, 30, 40% bumps come when you switch companies. And so, I think that's something that, again, I think most people get that now and most people do that. But that's one thing I think about. The other thing, now that I've had a minute to process this, is be an expert in something.
Mm,
And it doesn't have to be the world's biggest topic. In fact, being a big fish in a small pond, I think in business is much better as an expertise standpoint, right? I'm an expert in domain names. There aren't a whole lot of experts in domain names. It's not the world's biggest industry by any means, but I'm one of the go-to guys for this topic. And being that person, I think, is very valuable. So even if you work at a company, find some sort of niche you can carve out for yourself, that even within that company, when people think of this topic or that topic, they're like,
I
oh, I
know.
know who I need to
Yeah.
talk to. I need to call Andrew. And that is it elevates your importance within the company, but it also elevates your importance should you ever look outside of that company for a job.
Speaking of skills, is there something, and I think you had your head on straight from a youth, but is there a
Mhm.
skill that you really had to develop to be the person you are and the positions you are today, that it's even something you're still working on?
I would say I'm still working on being a risk taker. And some people say, well, you've worked for yourself for, over a decade. That must be risky. But I've always done kind of not the home run type risks. I go out and put something out there and then build on it and build on it. I mean, podcastguests.com, I started for under $5,000. Now I've invested a lot more into it, but it was one of those things where it's like, well, let me try this at a small level and see if I can build on it from there. I mean, there's higher risk and higher reward, and you get that higher reward by taking those risks. And sometimes you just have to do that, right? You need to go cold turkey sometimes, whether it's quitting a job to find another or to start a business. Taking risks, I think, is an important thing, and it's something we need to instill in everyone.
Or would you say that maybe you're an influencer in your field, and if so, you're a little adverse to risk because you don't want to make or lead people down an improper path?
So yes to that term. I mean, the way people use that term, yes. I would say in the domain name industry, for example, I'm an influencer,
Influencer.
but I am also very cautious. I think a lot of people get sucked into investing in domain names because they hear these great stories, and I'm the first to tell them it is not easy. It's easy to maybe have some luck once or twice, but it's not easy to do as a business, as an investment.
So it could look like, okay, you're a little afraid of risk, but you're also cautious and maybe caring and considerate about the things that you get into.
Those are all adjectives, yes, that I would use.
Moving down a little bit, where would you place, and speaking of that, of character, what is a top character trait that you have or deem necessary in your industry?
Well, I would say one that I have, I don't know if I deem it necessary in the industry, is just caring, right? Like I truly do. When I hear people's story, I care about it. Sometimes I can get a little bit too much wrapped into it. If we got wrapped around every person and their story, I think we emotionally we'd just kind of explode.
Hmm.
But I do think that's kind of a characteristic I have. I don't know, when I think about the people that I know that are successful, I think it depends on how you define success and which characteristics you need. There's a tenacity that, for people that want to make a lot of money need to have, right? They need to hustle, they need to work hard. But that's not necessarily what everyone should do, even though we said earlier, you work, that's what you do when you're an adult. That doesn't mean that you have to go work 80 hours a week, unless you have to do that to make ends meet. But it's not something that I think is a requirement. And I don't think we should judge people's contribution both to their company and society by how many hours they work. I just don't think that's necessarily a good measure.
No, it's guys. It's nice to hear, and I've only started asking this question, but I'm getting a variety of answers, and caring is certainly one of them. And you'll
Mm.
find people in many industries that don't care. They have a different
Oh, sure.
priority, and then
Oh, sure.
their coworkers become less important to them. What about an overarching goal for podcastguest.com or domain names?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an
Mm-hmm.
overarching goal? You want to be able to close your laptop once a week at least, or
From a work goal perspective, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly I set a goal of helping people, right, with podcastguest.com. And of course, I want to make money from it too, right? So I have financial goals that I think of. But the challenge with those types of goals is you're always moving the goalpost, right? And so I think a lot of people come out of college and are like, oh, I want to be a millionaire, or I want to be I want to have $5 million. I want to retire when I'm 30, that sort of thing. The problem is you're always moving the goalposts. If you do hit those goals, suddenly that's not a big enough goal, and then you go from there. So ultimately, my goal is to be happy, right? And I think for most people, that's their goal, but they might not think about it every day
Mhm.
and the choices they make. And how you define happiness, how you get there, um, I think it's different for a lot of people, but I do think that I know more about being happy now in my 40s than I did when I was in my teens and 20s, which makes
Certainly.
sense. And maybe it's just I've changed. Maybe it's just what makes me happy has
Well,
changed.
sometimes, and I believe that you help your wife. What is it in Stacey, the Internet of Things,
Yeah, I work
and
on her
having
business
those
as well.
goalposts from university, and then you get married, you learn a whole
I
bunch
am
of
not,
different variety of
yeah,
things. Is
I am
what
not
happened
doing
to
what
you?
I thought I would be doing when
Not at
I entered
all,
college. And yeah, I
but
think you
it's
need to be
good.
flexible though. Yeah, it's good. It's good. It's something that works for me. And that's the most important thing, that people find things that work for them and they're making them happy, whether that allows them to spend lots of time with family, if that's what makes them happy, if it's doing complex investment banking deals, if that's what makes them happy, whatever it is.
Andrew, knowing that you're behind the computer a lot, maybe generally some people may not know you. Is there anything that you would like people to know about you so they can have a better understanding, so they can appreciate you a little bit more, at least the work that you're doing?
Boy, I've had people ask me this question before, and it's something I've always kind of struggled to answer, because I don't put a lot of, I if I have my overarching goal being happy and helping people along the way, I don't know that there's anything that's, I mean, that's pretty simple premise at the end of the day, right?
Not for all people though,
Mm,
right? It's not, it's the idea of, I had a guest on yesterday who just said, I struggle. If you don't understand, he said, I have post-traumatic stress disorder
hmm
because of things I experienced in my life, and I'd like people to understand that. So if they actually see me going down the street, if I seem different, it's not because I don't want to be caring, I don't want to be these things, but I have difficulty out in public sometimes. So the
right.
idea of just getting a better understanding, or you could
hmm
just revisit or repeat the idea of just caring. I'm a really caring person. I really take people's interests. However,
Well,
you would define that.
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring up that example of your guest with PTSD, and that, as I've gotten older and experienced more, I suffer from anxiety. I suffer from it all the time. And one thing I try to do as a person, it's hard, but you never know what someone's deal is, right? And so, when there's someone who acts out or does something differently or comes across as rude when you're out in public, maybe they just lost one of their loved ones to COVID.
Mhm.
Maybe they just lost their job, right? And it doesn't necessarily reflect on them as a person in their entirety, if they act in a different way during a certain period of time. So I try to be a little bit more open-minded about that than I was when I was younger.
Andrew, is there any adversity that you faced throughout your life that one affects your job or your work positively or negatively, but not necessarily towards you, but encouragement for other people who are facing adversity and it might impact their work?
Right. I think, I've always tried to figure out where my anxiety comes from. And I think that anxiety leads to some risk adverse behavior. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, always going down that worrying hole, like, oh, but what if this happens? What if that happens? You know, and that sort of thing. And you know, I've always had people from the outside, you know, when you look at their situations, you're like, why are you worrying about that? That's no big deal, right? Whereas when it's yourself, right, you tend to worry about it, and people from the outside tell you, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. Um, or you will get through this. But I think that's part of why I've been on somewhat of a journey over the past few years to understand what makes me happy. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's quite a bit of behavioral science around happiness now. And I've tried to educate myself about that. And I would say that's one of the things that's helped me in recent years around that.
It reminds me of my dear wife, whatever topic it is about a job or a career, then I'll say, well, no, that's probably not going to work out. But if it did, and we did this, and we did that, and we did that, and then the worry, I'm like, no, honey,
Yeah.
we can't go in the hypothetical situation what would happen in all of these other situations. Let's just deal with the present. So it's
What
quite
I've been
interesting.
told is you go from the what if to the even if. Like, okay, even if that happens, you know, we still got each other, right? You know, which is something, you know, with your wife, even if you lost your
Yeah.
jobs, you
That's
know.
good though. That's good. I never thought
Yeah.
of it that way. Like, okay,
Yeah.
honey, we'll play this game for a moment. So even if
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
happens,
I'll engage you on that. Okay.
that's
Now
great.
what? You know, yeah.
Andrew, how can people reach you?
Uh, podcastguests.com. If you go there, you can email me at andrew@podcastguests.com. That's probably the easiest way to reach me. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm more active on my domain name wire handle there. So that's at domain name wire.
Andrew, one final question for you, and that is, why do you work?
Why do I work? I work because it gives me pleasure and ultimately it allows me to be happy.
Andrew Allemann, Domain Names Wire, podcastguest.com. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.